Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's District Administration web seminar, Addressing Unfinished Learning, Building a Continuity of Learning Plan in Mathematics, brought to you by the generous sponsorship of Carnegie Learning. Before we get underway, a few housekeeping items. For technical support, use the chat panel at the right of your screen and select my name, Jason York, and type your message. If you're having trouble hearing or prefer to listen privately, please dial the phone number and access code that we posted in the chat window shortly. To submit a question to our panel, and we welcome your questions, use the Q&A panel at the right of your screen. Send your question to all panelists, which is the default option. Don't see a panel? Click the Expand Panel triangle in front of the panel name. And finally, if you need to access the presentation at a later time or would like to share with your colleagues, everyone will receive an email with links to the slides and the archive recording. And with that, I'm going to turn it over now to Tamara Bousquet from Carnegie Learning, who will introduce and start our program.
Thank you, Jason. Hi, I'm Tamara Bousquet with Carnegie Learning, and we're delighted to be with you this afternoon and talk about the continuity of learning plan in math beyond assessment. I'm, again, Vice President at Carnegie Learning, and I'd like to introduce my colleagues. The first gentleman I'd like to introduce this afternoon is Dr. Justin Alio. Justin is the Director of Innovation at Montour School District in Pennsylvania, and also the Director of Academic Achievement. He's been doing some very interesting things with predictive analytics and artificial intelligence in Montour. We're going to have a chance to hear more about that today. I'd also like to introduce Amy Jones-Lewis. You see there on the screen. Amy is our Senior Director of Instructional Design at Carnegie Learning, and also the author of our textbook series. And so she's going to talk today about some of the projects we've been engaged in around unfinished learning and fall reentry plans. And then lastly, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Stephen Ritter. Dr. Ritter is our Chief Cognitive Scientist at Carnegie Learning and also the co-founder of the company. And again, he's involved in a lot of exciting research projects and continues to work in development and support the work at Carnegie Learning. So Dr. Ritter, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Tamara. For people who are not familiar with Carnegie Learning, I'll give a brief background. We started at Carnegie Mellon University about 20 years ago. We started in the psychology department, specifically cognitive psychology, and studying how people learn. And from that experience, we started building computer models that simulate student learning and then applying those models to mathematics education. And that's the origin of our Mathia software and the approach that we take to instruction. And ultimately, what it ends up being is a smart AI system that assesses students' knowledge while it's teaching. It's built on collecting data from students so that we understand what's working and what isn't, and we can incrementally improve the effectiveness of our system over time. And then we combine that with really high quality content. And so ultimately we get a system that we know improves student outcomes. One indication of that is a recent award that we got as Best Artificial Intelligence Solution in the EdTech Awards this year, which we're really proud of that award. Tamara? You're on mute, Tamara.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Dr. Ritter, for that introduction. One of the things that we talked about before the webinar today was some of the things that we're hearing from other districts that we've been speaking to over the last few months as we're dealing with our new reality. And over again, we've been hearing questions and challenges around equity and access, continuity of learning. How do we transition between brick and mortar and at-home learning, if that is a possibility in the fall? How do we continue to encourage student collaboration and discourse in a virtual world? How do we use data and assessment coming back this fall? And how do we meet the needs of our special populations and diverse learners? But I would love it right now, if you would, in the chat feature, if you could share with us some of the priorities and challenges if beyond this. These are the things that we thought were most critical that we were hearing about. But if you have specific challenges or priorities that you want to make sure that we address today, if you could put that into the chat box. And Dr. Ritter, you can go to the next slide. So if there are any other things outside of the issues of equity and access, okay, well, we're seeing a few things coming in. Engaging students online. We'll give it a couple more minutes, a couple more seconds. Sounds like we probably have identified the things that are a top of mind for this audience today. Keeping students progressing while addressing gaps. And that is, we're going to talk a good bit about that today as well. All right, Dr. Ritter, why don't we go on to the next slide? Keeping all students engaged in a mixed environment. That's great. We'll go on to talking about equity and access.
Yeah, so as we've all experienced with the pandemic and also with the Black Lives Matter protests going on now, equity is really top of mind now. We've seen as we watch students attempt to participate in school from their homes during the pandemic, that there's clearly different access that students have to the technology that they might need, the resources that they might need, and their home environments that are conducive to education. And so thinking about that is really fundamental to how we think about how we start up next year. At Carnegie Learning, part of our background, since as I mentioned before, we came out of a psychology background and thinking about how students learn, we took this as a guiding principle that the more that we understand about how students think and learn, the better we can help them think and learn. And what that really means in terms of equity is honoring and taking into account each student's individual strengths and weaknesses, needs and preferences when we're doing instruction. It's always a process. It's never perfect, but we take as our goal the need to address each student exactly where they are and then move them to where they need to be. And that requires treating students as individuals. What it ends up in our approach in Mathia, and for people who aren't familiar, the screenshot on the left is one type of problem in Mathia. We'll see some more later. We try and give students complex real-world problems to solve, and then essentially have the software watch what students do as they solve them, just like a teacher might do looking over the student's shoulder, and then provide feedback to students when the students get off track or when they need help. And when the student's progressing well, just letting the student go. And that includes letting the student kind of solve the problem or approach the mathematics in a way that makes most sense to them, as opposed to kind of always trying to make the students follow some predefined path through a problem. And we've seen that this approach is very effective with students from all backgrounds. On the left is the results of the largest randomized controlled trial, so very formal, rigorous evaluation of an algebra curriculum. It was done with Carnegie Learning's blended Algebra 1 curriculum. And students using that curriculum roughly doubled their growth and knowledge compared to control group students. On the right, you see a report from Ed Reports, which is an independent nonprofit that evaluates curriculum along various dimensions. And as you can see, we got near perfect scores from Ed Reports. We're very proud of that as well.
Thank you, Dr. Ritter. So one of the things we wanted to ask of you, and I see we're getting some good participation in the chat, what strategies are you incorporating in your school or district to address equity and access? I know that the current crisis that we're working through has really exposed a lot of the challenges that we have had and continue to have with equity and access. And I know there's lots of things I've heard about in terms of delivering packets with buses and putting mobile Wi-Fi access through buses into communities, into neighborhoods. So are there some things that you're doing in your school or district differently to address equity and access? And Amy and Dr. Ritter, we did have a question from the group on what is the best platform to engage students online. Zoom, Microsoft Teams, are there recommendations that we have with the work that we've been doing around the best platform? And I think we're working with all of them, correct?
Yeah, that's true. I would say that at that level of platform, there may be personal preferences and differences, but I think one of the hardest things in the shift has been shifting from kind of synchronous classes, expecting every student to kind of be online at the same time, and the more asynchronous nature of the home environment, and particularly with the equity issues, because what we find is often, even if a student does have access to a computer at home, it may be shared with the whole family, and there are multiple kids there and adults who need to use it. And so it's not realistic to expect the student to be online at the same time as all the other students. And so managing that asynchronous support is really challenging.
Yes, and it's interesting, some of the districts that we're working with, they're using a combination of both, and managing that asynchronous is challenging. All right, well, let's go on to the next slide. Unfinished learning and learning gaps. Amy, I think this might be you. Amy, you're on mute.
Hit it twice. Sorry about that. So we were doing a lot of work around talking to districts about, how they're going to handle the incoming students for the next school year, how they're going to think about where to place students, what kind of support students need. And really what is true is that although this crisis is highlighting this problem, this is not a new problem. And I know we don't have end of year course data this year, but this is something that we are constantly thinking about. This was an issue last year, it'll be an issue next year, but certainly right now with the highlights of what's going on, we know that we need to really understand what students know and are able to do as we think about our year of instruction. And so we really highly recommend a 4-step process for schools. The most important thing at the very beginning is identifying and interpreting student readiness. What content are students ready for? What are their strengths? What are misconceptions that students have around mathematics content that they've gotten in the past? And what are the gaps that we see either through that assessment, or we know that there will be gaps because we know what was not taught during the end of the last school year. And taking some time and assessing and identifying students, understanding whether or not these are gaps that impact the whole class. Is this a gap that impacts a small subset of the students? And then thinking about where that fits in the mathematical arc of the particular school year. So we recommend that next year that you start the year with on grade level content, that your 8th grade students are learning 8th grade content. And instead of front loading all of the remediation that they may need from these identified areas of weakness or gaps, instead of front loading that all in the beginning where it's not connected to current learning, it's about looking at the arc of math and interweaving those elements of remediation right next to where they're going to need it. So if there's a particular concept that I know my students have some readiness issues with, then I'm going to do that remediation before that topic, and not all, starting August with that. We didn't have end of course or end of year assessments this year. It'll be interesting to see. The plan right now, everything's changing, but the plan right now is for states to reinstate these assessments next year. And so we have to get kids on grade level content. And so understanding how these pieces fit in is very, very important into making sure they get what they need at a grade for that particular grade. So developing that plan For instruction, maybe thinking about it 9 weeks at a time, because as instruction goes, these gaps will be filled. So am I going to look at the second 9 weeks after we've had 9 weeks back of instruction? And what do I need to revisit as I go along throughout the year as I'm filling in these gaps? Just two things that we know are true. We know they're true always, not just right now during this crisis. One is that perception matters. And so do we perceive that our students are going to be successful and that they have strengths that they're bringing to the table? That's important. That's readily documented that has a major impact in the classroom. So are we looking for strengths as we're identifying gaps? And number two, we say all the time, right, students are not blank slates. Even though they have, who knows how long the slide is going to be from the last time they've been in the classroom, they are not blank slates. They come to us with a lot of information. Sometimes they are messy boards where they have lots of maybe disconnected knowledge. And our job then is to not treat them like they're blank slates, but then really plug in the information that they need so they can make connections and kind of clean up the boards that they come to us with. So we're thinking about this readiness all the time. We're thinking about unfinished learning. And I know Dr. Ritter has a case in point around a specific instance of analysis of unfinished learning.
Thank you, Amy.
Thanks.
Yes, we actually heard from one of our participants that makes a lot of sense. It answered one of her big questions. And one of the things I will send out to everybody, there is a paper, an acceleration guide that's been provided by TNTP, the New Teacher Project, that I think goes into a little more detail, some of the things that Amy was just talking about. So if you haven't read it, I'll make sure to send that out to folks after this today. And Dr. Ritter, you take it away.
Sure. Following up on what Amy said about gaps and unfinished learning, I wanted to give a kind of concrete illustration of what it looks like when students come in as these kind of messy boards with disconnected knowledge, and also the kinds of information that you need to know in order to understand the way students are thinking about problems. So in a traditional assessment, like shown here, the student might be asked a question like, what's 1/2 times 1/5? In this case, the student answered 1, which I hope everyone recognizes is the wrong answer. But when you see that answer, you might be tempted to conclude, well, this student doesn't know anything about fractions. I'm going to have to start from square one. But one of the techniques that we use is to ask the student to think out loud while they're solving a problem. And so I'm showing a transcript of what the student actually says as he's solving this problem. And he says, well, 1/2 times 1/5. Now I have to find a multiple of 10. So 1/2 goes to 5/10, and 1/5 goes to 2/10, and then multiply that, and that would be 1 whole. Now, what we do with this information is try and take that and understand, like, how did the student end up with that 1 whole? Well, the student starts saying, I need to find a multiple of 10. You may recognize the terminology is not quite right, but what the student's really saying is I need a common denominator, and that common denominator is 10. And one of the things that you notice from these students is this student in particular was very quick at coming to that conclusion, was also very quick and accurate at doing equivalent fractions, but it's in the framework of a procedure that doesn't make sense, or at least doesn't make sense to us as knowledgeable mathematicians. From the student's perspective, though, it makes perfect sense, because what the student's doing is exactly analogous to what you would do when adding fractions. When the student says, I need to find a multiple of 10, again, the student means common denominators. Student's able to convert 1/2 to 5/10, 1/5 to 2/10. And then the student says, multiply that. I think the student's saying, oh, well, I need to apply that operator multiplication to the numerator. So 5 times 2 is 10. I keep that common denominator as 10. I now have 10 over 10, which simplifies to 1. Just like you would do if you're adding fractions. Find the common denominator, apply an operator to the numerators, addition in this case, keep that common denominator, and simplify if needed. So the important thing to understand is, from the student's perspective, this makes perfect sense. And this is very consistent with the way the mind works, that you're not pulling things whole out of memory, like pulling out the procedure for how to multiply fractions out of your memory. Most of what memory is a combination of pulling out disconnected facts and some reconstruction. And part of the reason why we emphasize conceptual understanding is that conceptual understanding helps you reconstruct procedures that make sense with respect to the true mathematical understanding, rather than kind of a surface analogy between multiplying and addition that student has done. And so asking students to verbalize or probing deeply about not just the answer that they get, but the way that they come to that answer can help identify some of these elements of unfinished learning.
So again, we'll throw a question out to the group. As you're thinking about fall reentry, what are some of the things that you're considering for the reentry plans? We're hearing a lot of different things from different districts. I think the state of Virginia announced last week that they were going to go back in a completely phase 1 virtual mode and work with students still at home and gradually open schools. I've heard of others that we're thinking about doing an A-B schedule, or bringing in elementary school students first and having their middle and high school students working from home, and also how they're going to be able to make decisions around the data that they don't have, and how do we identify those students and what they need in terms of their gaps coming back in the fall, and how to really work with those students, as Amy was suggesting, to get them on grade level content. So any other suggestions or recommendations that your district is planning for fall? Very good. Identify priority standards, provide in-time formative assessments to address gaps and accelerate learning, as opposed to living in a world of remediation. That's great. Developing delivery plan, online versus face-to-face. An enriched virtual learning environment. In math, planning to do flipped classroom with students able to work at their own pace. This is great.
Can I add something while we're getting more comments back?
Sure.
One of the things that I didn't mention, but I should have, is thinking about not just particular grade levels in isolation. So as you're making these plans, think about what the scope looks like across some grade levels. So most of the time at the end of the school year, what you're missing are some statistics, some probability, some geometry. Those tend to be the things that are taught at the end of the year. And in some cases, you know, if students miss 7th grade probability, they're not going to use probability again until they get into the high school standards. So understanding where does that need to be fit into your 8th grade content? That's something that you need to consider and think about. Or do you need to say in 2 years or 3 years when you get to geometry, now I need to plug this in before I start talking about compound probability and conditional probability and geometry. So thinking about like really large spans of content and where we can fix or fit in for the gaps, not necessarily for the unfinished learning. You might need to fill that in earlier, but as far as learning gaps, where you want to think about the whole continuum.
Thank you, Amy. I think that's really resonating. All right, Dr. Ritter, next slide. I think we may be introducing Dr. Alio now.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, good day. My name is Dr. Justin Alio. I'm the Director of Innovation in District Academic Achievement, which is a fancy word for curriculum director. So it might be some curriculum directors on this call. But we're located outside the Pittsburgh region, and we are Getting Smart Top 15 Schools Worth Visiting in America, and also a League of Innovative Schools. But I want to go back and start with equity and access, because that's why we actually got into adaptive software tutoring systems many years ago, because we felt a need that using those type of technology skills, we did not want to let students get behind or fall behind. We wanted to address every student individually. So that's why we adapted these systems. And since we've adapted those systems, our test scores and everything that we do have just completely skyrocketed. You know, a funny story, Mr. Thompson, a high school math teacher, he said, before I adopted these type of tools, these adaptive software tutoring system tools to look at individual pathways, one of the things I used to come into class, I used to look at what content do I need to teach? What skills do I need to teach? What is the lesson of the day? But after addressing this new type of technology, a new type of learning, he now looks at what do my students need to learn? Where are they on their personalized learning journey? And he totally flipped his whole script from this teacher-directed learning environment to the student-centered directed learning environment. But just using AI and being consumers of AI or other technology-enhanced innovations just wasn't good enough for us. We wanted our teachers and students to also be part of learning about artificial intelligence. So back in 2018, we actually launched America's first artificial intelligence program, K through 12. When we launched that, we needed to find great partners, and one of the partners was actually Carnegie Learning. On its call, Dr. Ritter, who's talking to you today, I approached Steve and said, Steve, we want to teach some type of artificial intelligence, machine learning, those type of skills to our students. Do you have any ideas? And he actually said, yes, I've been working on something to have students learn a little bit more about data literacy and so forth. So we actually came up with a really cool program for our middle school students that we teach in our computer science, where students actually manipulate code in order for the machine to learn how to play tic-tac-toe eventually in order to beat you every single time. So that was a great experience for us on our artificial intelligence pathways. But fast forwarding to 2020, back in March, when we had to transition this shift, as all of you did, really from a face-to-face to remote learning, virtual learning, synchronous, asynchronous learning, whatever we called it, we actually felt like we were in a really good situation, better than expected because of our past practices using adaptive software tutoring systems. We had students go through and they were taught as individuals. We had teachers monitoring everything on the back end, addressing their needs where they need to be met. It actually helped with our instructional planning, and we didn't need to feel like we needed to assess formal assessments throughout the way, because we were doing mini formal assessments or live tracking of data during this whole time. In fact, I had a middle school parent call me, and they said, Dr. Alia, I'm not into this homeschool virtual learning. I feel like it's a waste of time. My kid's on a computer, and they're just learning this math. It doesn't really count. They're not in school taking a test. I was like, no, sir. We actually, everything your child's doing, we are tracking on the back end. And we are actually making your child aware of their own personal learning needs. And we're working with them and calling them to see where they are in their pathway, because we already know where they are. So we want to make sure they know where they are. And together, we're going to help them get there. In fact, when we come back in the fall, we feel, again, that we are going to be in a really good position, because we don't need to assess students as soon as they come back to see what they've lost from March till August. We are able to track that again from March until we finished in June, and we have all that data. We have the predictive analytics to see where students should be when they come back in August and September. So we're very confident within our instructional planning, our assessments moving forward, that we'll be able to pick up on track where students are in the fall. Maybe not as good as we have done in the past, but we're, again, pretty confident. So I just want to thank everyone out there listening to this call. Thank the team at Carnegie Learning, and know that we're all in it together. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or anybody on this call or anybody on this webinar today. And good luck, and thank you, and have a great summer.
Thank you, Dr. Alio. So, Steve, you want to extend that conversation from what Justin was telling us?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. There have been a number of questions about assessment in the chat, and I have this little diagram that illustrates how I think about assessment. And the important thing to think about is treating assessment not necessarily as a formal test, but as a way of gaining information. And depending on the kind of information that you need to gain, the kind of decisions that you're trying to make with assessments, you might do different levels of assessment and diagnosis. So at the top level, you need to make decisions about what's the basic math course that a student should be in. Is the student ready for Algebra 1? Should the student be in pre-algebra? Should the student repeat a previous year of math? So at a high level, you can make a fairly coarse-grained placement test to make that decision. But that's also a very high-stakes test. If you make a mistake and have a student repeat a year that the student doesn't need to repeat, or move the student ahead too quickly, that can have severe consequences for the student needs to do. And so you want to make sure that there are opportunities to reconsider that. In the middle are instructional planning decisions. So given that you have the student generally in the right place, or a group of students generally in the right course for them, you might use some instructional planning assessments up front or on a continuing basis to help with instructional planning, to understand, is this class in general up to speed on the geometry that they need to know to succeed in this course. Where a product like Mathia excels is at the lower level of differentiation. So what Mathia is doing is, once we're in the kind of right topics, it's able to identify the specific gaps in knowledge, the specific skills and elements of unfinished learning that individual students may need to focus on. And particularly important is when the case is, as it always is, for all students that each student has different strengths and weaknesses. So to illustrate that, I'll give you a quick view of a different problem within Mathia. On the left side is a proportional reasoning problem with someone's hiking the Appalachian Trail. They're hiking at 9 miles per day. The question is, if a hike across New Jersey takes 8 days, what's the length of the trail in New Jersey? And you can see this is a partially completed problem. The students set up a proportion, and the student's going to represent something like X miles over 8 days equals 9 miles over 1 day, because it's 9 miles per day. On the right is what we call the scalometer. These dials fill up dynamically as the student solves problems. So each step in the problem, selecting a unit of measure, filling out a cell here, solving equations later, corresponds to one or more skills on the scalometer. And the student's task is to fill up all those circles. The circles only fill up most quickly when the student gets things right without needing to ask for help and without making errors. One of the things that you probably can't read on this slide, but to illustrate the kinds of distinctions that we're making for students, is this particular problem for many students is harder than another problem that might be equivalent. Because the problem says 9 miles per day, a lot of students have difficulty in representing the denominator in this unit rate here, 9 miles over 1 day, because the 1 is implicit in that phrase, not explicit. Some students find it easier if the problem had said 9 miles every 2 days. And that's one of the skills that we're tracking. And so since Mathia is tracking that skill, it's able to understand which particular students might have difficulty in translating 9 miles per day into a fraction of 9 over 1, and then providing specific instruction, focus, and additional practice problems to students who are having trouble with that skill. What we do then is aggregate the students' full performance into what we call an applause score. That APLSE stands for Adaptive Personalized Learning Score. So because students use Mathia roughly 2 days a week as their regular mathematics instruction, Mathia is tracking every answer that the student makes and every hint that the student asks for. On the left, you see a graph where we show the applause score that students earned from 0 to 100%, and then the final end-of-year test score. This was back 2 years ago when we had end-of-year tests. And you can show that there's a strong correlation between how many applause points students were able to earn over the course of the full school year using Mathia and their performance on the end of year. This is a state exam. And what that means is we can make a prediction about how ready a student is to achieve the goals of that exam by the end of the year. and whether the student's on course to meet those end-of-year goals. So on the right, you can see an applause report, which is essentially a progress monitoring report that tracks over time students' progression towards the end-of-year goals and readiness for that end-of-year test. Ultimately, my long-term goal for this is to be able to say, well, look, if having gone through Mathia, if we already understand what a student knows and doesn't know well enough to predict how well they're going to do on that end-of-year test, they shouldn't have to take the test. The same way that as teachers, you interact with students every day, you get to understand very well what the students know and don't know. You can predict very well how well they do on the exams. What Mathia does, though, is standardize that in the same way that an exam does, and so students are put on the same scale. So that's one approach for assessment, and in particular this year it was really interesting because even without the end-of-year tests, if you had been using Mathia, your students had been using Mathia, you can understand very well where they stand on that. Another use of data is through what we call LiveLab. LiveLab is an application that you can use to monitor students as they are working in the Mathia tool. And the focus with LiveLab is to help the teachers focus on the students who most need assistance. So one of the things we found over the years is that often the student who's most likely to ask for help is not necessarily the student who most needs help. So what LiveLab does is monitoring that student data second by second, interprets which students are struggling productively, meaning they might be making errors, but they're on the path to success, versus students who are unproductively struggling, making errors, but not really making progress. And so the complicated graph on the right is kind of an illustration of the type of data that we're using kind of behind the scenes. You can see that blue curve is students who reach mastery fairly quickly. They're doing just fine. The red and green curves are students who take longer to reach mastery. They're making more errors. They're asking for more hints, but they're learning from that, from the errors and hints, and they're making progress, and they will ultimately reach mastery. It's the purple students that we're most worried about, and those are the ones where the teacher can be the best assistant to the student. Because if the student is making errors that are not indicative, not learning from those errors, maybe there's a way the teacher can intervene and give the student a different model, a different experience, or different advice on how to ultimately master that content.
Thank you, Steve. So again, I know we've talked about this. We've had a lot of questions in the chat around data and assessment. Are there any other things that you're thinking about in terms of using, universal screeners or using data in different ways for the fall? And if you could reply in the chat, that would be great. I did want to comment, as we're waiting for responses, Dr. Ritter, on LiveLab. I know that when we created LiveLab, we were thinking we'd be in a brick and mortar setting, and teachers could, intervene in the moment when they saw a student surfing on the web, or engaging or struggling with the problem, or really having success. We've also seen that teachers have been in professional development and can pull it up while their kids are working in there and say, hey, I see that you're struggling with this. And we've gotten feedback like, how does my teacher have eyes in the back of their head? And we have observed that this is being used in this virtual world as well, so that we can have those check-ins with our students, even if we're not side by side. So Dr. I think we can move on. I think, again, we've already gotten a good bit of feedback around data and assessment. And so let's talk about continuity of learning. Amy, I think this is you.
Yes, it is. So the other piece that we're really doing a lot of professional development and work with schools around is understanding how to maintain continuity of learning. So regardless of where your students are sitting, whether or not they're sitting in a classroom today and a virtual classroom tomorrow, if it's all of your students or part of your students, how can we maintain students' learning as they progress through the year? And so we have been putting together a number of different resources for schools to use, both including students, teachers, and the educational leaders within the district. For as some of you know, although maybe not all, our instructional resources involve a blended solution where students are working in textbook for part of the day or for part of the year, and then they work in Mathia as well, which is the software Steve was talking about to support they go hand in hand to support each other as students go through the standards they need to learn for that year. And so for Mathia, we're working on our reports. How do we enhance the reports that we provide to teachers and to students? How do we connect them better with Live Lab? What are the resources that we have in Live Lab? And then how do we work with districts in understanding how the applause score, what that tells them about their particular district. Then as far as the math book, the textbook piece that students are using, we have made available what we call Live Hint, which is an app, or it's a website that you can go to on your phone where you can look up practice problems that are in the assignments that come with each of the lessons. And you can ask for hints on a given practice problem so that when students are working from home, if they have a parent with them, excuse me, or not, they still have access to support as they're working through those resources. We have videos. We have lesson overview videos that students can watch. So if for whatever reason they weren't able to be in class, to have the teacher facilitate a lesson, we have overview lessons that they can use to guide their work through it. And then, you know, the thing that a drum that I will beat every year, it doesn't matter if it is in the height of a global pandemic or not, is that if you want students to collaborate, if you want great student discourse, be that virtual or face-to-face, if you want any of those things, and you need the instructional resources that support you and that support students to have those conversations and have those collaborations. So we're constantly thinking it throughout our materials about how we can really fill that in for students and give them opportunities to have a really coherent experience through math and think about connections and not think about math as an isolated set of ideas, but instead as a coherent arc. And so having those resources as the foundation for whatever environment you're in is really, really critical. And so then as we think about transitioning to these hybrid situations, we have a professional learning team that is the best in the business, who are running around working with districts, hearing their pain points, connecting them to resources, really working with them to make whatever unique experience they have in their district, make that work for them, because we know ultimately what's important is how we take whatever we get in the fall and how do we make that work so that students can continue to be successful. As far as educational leadership and thought leadership, we have webinar series. We have a national institute that has gone virtual for this year that starts next week. We have lots of opportunities. That the professional learning is not just for teachers, it's for administration as well. So we're trying to get all of these different pieces together to support schools as they are transitioning to make sure that students have access to the kind of instruction that they'll need regardless of where they're seated. And Tamara, I think you have some information about our K-5 push button videos.
Yeah, a couple of things I want to say. I see a couple of comments in the chat where we're talking about how do we think about onboarding students to these experiences and how do we discuss math online. I will send out to everyone after the webinar today a link to a couple of the virtual summer sessions that we're doing around specifically those topics, like how do we encourage a collaboration, not only with our students, but with one another, and how do we support those conversations. So I'll make sure that you get links to some of those summer modules. And then, as Amy was saying, we have also worked with districts around the country to support them in the K-5 world. As Steve was saying, we are grade 6 through Algebra 2 or Integrated Math 3 with our resources, but because we're focusing across the board in this new virtual world, we have worked with districts to create some push-button lessons that use a lot of these same philosophical approach. So we're engaging with students, making those links to prior knowledge, as Amy was talking about, those messy boards that we're trying to make those connections, and then having them to develop that understanding, conceptual understanding, and then having that opportunity to demonstrate mastery. So there are some samples of those K-5 lessons that we've put together at this point for the summer and for the first part of school coming back in the fall, and we're going to continue to work on that. So now we are near the end of our time together. Thank you so much for your enthusiasm and your participation. We want to open it up to Q&A if there are other questions that you have for us, or if you're interested in talking with Dr. Ritter or with Dr. Alio about data and assessment or artificial intelligence, if there are opportunities to talk more about unfinished learning, whether that is coming back in the fall or just the unfinished learning that we've always dealt with, or want more information about continuity of resources, you can certainly type in one of these numbers in the chat box and we'll get back to you to set up a time for you to meet with our panelists. Or if you have just general questions in the Q&A, happy to field those. All right. I'm not seeing too many coming through at this moment. I'll give you a little more time to type. Dr. Alio, Dr. Ritter, Amy, any parting words before we move on?
No, thank you and good luck this year. Please keep in touch. Remember, we're all in this together, so please continue to communicate with each other and learn from each other. And we're in it for the students, and thank you so much for what you do every day.
Thank you all. Jason, is there anything here in terms of wrapping up that you want to share with us as we complete today's session?
No, thanks. A lot of great insights, a lot of great takeaways there. Amy, Steve, and Justin, thanks very much for your time today. District administration is the leader in editorial coverage for news, trends, and current issues in K-12 management. You can subscribe for free or stay up to date through our print magazine, digital edition, email newsletters, and web seminars like this one that you heard today. So on behalf of district administration and the generous sponsorship of Carnegie Learning today, thank you all for joining us. The archive recording of this web seminar will be available tomorrow, and you'll be able to share with your team members at the following website. And you will also, by registering and attending, will receive an email link to the slides and the recording as well. So on behalf of district administration, this is Jason York. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.